With the development of Fire Emblem Thracia 776 concluded, series creator Shozou Kaga would leave Intelligent Systems behind. But Fire Emblem wouldn't stop there. Even during the development of Thracia, another team was working hard to figure out the next step for the series. Fire Emblem 64, the Maiden of Darkness, would be on its way to a video game system near you. And by a video game system near you, I mean a Japanese Nintendo 64. But with one company restructuring and a flopped 64 disk drive later, it came to a point where continuing development for the console title was no longer viable. And thus, Fire Emblem 64 was cancelled. But it would once again pick up on the Game Boy Advance, this time as Fire Emblem: The Binding Blade. For this title, someone needed to take up responsibility. Intelligent Systems needed a man with gusto! A man who had the leadership skills to bring Fire Emblem into a new generation. A man who knew the series, both inside and out. Quite literally. Meet Tohru Narihiro. While we never discussed him in the retrospective previously, he is integral to the Fire Emblem series even to this very day. Up to this point, he was typically a programmer for the series, but for Binding Blade, he stepped up to director. While this was the only Fire Emblem game he directed, with this one title, we can clearly see what was on his mind during the development process. Re-establishment. Keep in mind that Fire Emblem as a series still didn't have a standard formula yet. And with the previous game they were working on getting cancelled, it's clear that Narihiro wanted to go back to basics, to reinvent the wheel once again, and let that be the standard going forward. This would also explain why Binding Blade was more or less a soft reboot of the series. It was set on the continent of Alib, as far as we know, a land nowhere geographically close to any other continent in the series seen previously, with not even so much as a lore tidbit that relates it to any other game. While there weren't any direct references, Binding Blade's story featured a script that was an amalgamation of every story in the Fire Emblem series so far, featuring a set of actors that had very similar qualifications to Shadow Dragon in particular. We see a spirited and ambitious youth in the form of Roy, a prince of Fare called home by his bedridden father and asked to help defend the greater nation of Lycia in his stead, protecting it from the forces of Bern. Led by King Zephiel, Bern is by far the mightiest of the nations, and in its current state is a danger to the entire continent if left unchecked, already taking over two of the major regions of Alib. So immediately Roy sets off to find Hector, a man with so much street cred he could probably dunk on Bern by himself if he felt like it. Along the way, Roy meets up with many familiar archetypes to the series, including a distraught princess of great importance. Roy crosses paths with Guinevere, princess of Bern and sister to King Zephiel. She is opposed to the war her brother is starting, and wishes to seek out the nobles of Lycia to put an end to the conflict peacefully. Sadly, it doesn't end that simply. Bern is more successful pushing into Allied territory than expected. Within the beginning weeks of the war, the core force of Bern assaults Castle Erevan and kills Hector. You heard me right, Fire Emblem 7 players. Hector dies in this game.
Roy, I'm sorry I couldn't do more to protect you. Please, I beg of you, take over as General of the Lycian League in my stead.
Well, I'm only 15 and I've never been in more than a few skirmishes in my life, but yeah, I'll be general. From then on, it's a matter of Roy essentially proving himself. He's looked down on by many people and is sent to do what is essentially the military equivalent of grunt work. It isn't until the halfway point of the game when Roy rightfully earns the respect of his allies, at which point he finally takes the fight directly to Bern. Binding Blade's plot overall is well composed, if still rather formulaic in terms of where the series has already been. Elite puts a lot of effort into its world building, even though it still isn't as good as either of the Yggdrasil games. Everything else still feels very safe. The characters are standard, and the game's more significant revelations still fall in the similar trappings of previous games in the series. In some cases, it was worse than before. This is the first game in the series to feature a true ending scenario since Mystery of the Emblem. You'll need to finish every side quest in the game to get there, but doesn't make it clear what the optional objectives are to unlock them. But it would be an insult to this game not to bring up the King of Bern himself, Zephiel. One of the favorite villains in the Fire Emblem community, and among mine as well. This guy is a badass. Whenever this guy shows up on screen, it's a total holy crap moment. What's especially cool about him is that he's both the instigator of the war and not just evil for the sake of it. While his actions aren't justifiable, they're understandable given his nihilistic worldview. Zephiel, why? Why did you awaken the demon dragon?
I have daddy issues.
Oh. It's a little upsetting this game doesn't try to push its narrative in ways the series hadn't seen before, but I can forgive it. Binding Blade makes a lot more sense when viewing this game essentially as restarting the series. And that idea of rebooting the series extended far from beyond its story. Binding Blade was made to be much easier than any game that came previously. And to accomplish this, that meant stripping away a lot of the innovations that previous games brought to the series. Multiple mission objectives were removed, inventory sizes were reduced, dismounting was axed from this point onward, skills would be taken out, leadership stars were gone, no more capturing enemies, along with a myriad of quirks that were left behind. But hey, the important stuff was still here. The weapons triangle was present as always, and rescuing was one of the few carryovers from Thracia. Though Binding Blade did have a few things of its own to introduce as well. Let's start out with the most important one. Binding Blade was the first game of the series to properly change its random number generator, at least when it came to hit rates. In every Fire Emblem game previous, the game generates a number between 0 and 99, and if the generated number is lower than the displayed hit rate, that attack would connect. On paper, this sounds like a fair system, but ask anyone who's played the earlier Fire Emblem games about the RNG, and they would probably be quick to talk about how random it is. Is random the right word to use when talking about RNG? So Binding Blade offers up a solution. Instead of the one number being pulled for the basis of your hit chance, the game instead pulls two numbers, averages them together, and uses that number to compare it to your accuracy. Think of it this way. Any hit rate below 50 has a reduced chance to strike, while anything above 50 now has a greater chance to connect. Ladies and gentlemen, this changes everything! While the UI was less honest than ever, it ironically feels much more accurate. Imagine the scenario of having less than 20% chance to strike, landing on more than one occasion in a row. Or even in the last episode, where I remarked how strange it was I encountered multiple instances of a 99% hit chance missing. In theory, how could I be mad at that? It's a possible outcome even though it isn't probable. But the gambling part of our brains tells us that something is wrong in that scenario, because the expected outcomes aren't coming to pass. So it shouldn't be surprising that this modification was a good idea that would persist going forward throughout the entire series. Except for Fates and Shadows of Valentia, these two are weird cases. That's not the only new thing that Binding Blade did though. The other changes it made were much more tangible and much more appreciated. Binding Blade was the first game of the series where you could change the starting positions of your selected army. Finally! Gone are the days where you need to spend the first turn of every chapter shifting your units to get them in the position you want. Requiring players to split their armies wasn't a disadvantage anymore. You could make sure every side had a balanced team. You could put your mounted units in back to give your infantry a head start to the objective, or even do the opposite and let your units get the farthest reach faster. Perhaps you even carefully position your units so they could take advantage of their support bonuses immediately. If you've played any of the later games in the series, then you're no doubt familiar with the support system. As characters spend their turns next to people they're compatible with, they could accrue points together, which upon reaching a certain threshold, would unlock a conversation between the two that, when viewed, granted a boost to various statistics based on the other's affinity. It was a mix between leadership stars, bond levels, and the love system that was seen in previous games. And adding narrative context to all of them incentivized players who weren't about min-maxing their armies to go after them. But the system wasn't perfected yet. Despite having numerous combinations of supports that characters can get, every character can only have a total of 5 conversations. From a balancing perspective, makes sense. If you could have 9 characters all in range giving support bonuses to one person, it would make them pretty busted. But if you wanted to see every person's support conversations, you would have to replay the game an unreasonable number of times to get there. And supports weren't easy to attain either. Aside from the game not telling you who can actually support, every combination of characters grows at varying rates. But the lowest end of the spectrum will require at least 60 turns for some characters to raise a support rank. That's 60 turns that 2 characters need to be standing next to each other. An average run for any select chapter in the game is roughly 15 to 20 turns on the higher end, meaning you would have to spend at least 3 chapters at minimum building for 1 support rank. And that's assuming that there wasn't a situation where you needed to split those 2 characters up at all during playtime. Thankfully, those issues were addressed in the later games, and even made substantial improvements even by the next one, but it's severely flawed in this iteration specifically. And to be honest, that's really all the big new features from Binding Blade. I mean, unless you want to count the fact that this game featured a brand new hard mode for the people who already completed it. And there were even optional features included, such as trial maps for people who wanted to play beyond the main story, or even through the series' first foray into multiplayer, with a Link Arena. You could pit your units against your friends, and see who is the better strategist during their playthrough. Hardly compelling features if you ask me, but a neat bonus for the people who would want to make use of them. But while it's not a new feature, there is one important aspect that Binding Blade changed in order to make Fire Emblem a more comfortable and engaging experience. This was the first game in the series to be played on a handheld, as I'm sure you're no doubt aware. You could take this game with you everywhere. On the bus, at school, to the park, you name it. But the development team does deserve credit for this one thing in particular. It's not easy to make a handheld iteration of a previously console-exclusive series. You see, Fire Emblem's past games were inconvenient to play based on not doing much to assist the player in making the best decisions from moment-to-moment gameplay. In the early days of Fire Emblem, this was okay. There weren't a lot of strategy RPGs to learn from yet, and being able to play on a big screen would allow you to take in a lot of information all at once. But the thing about the Game Boy Advance is that doesn't work anymore. Navigating between 3 different windows just to see how much damage you would do would be cumbersome on a screen that was this tiny and didn't even have backlighting. Team Emblem was faced with the challenge of shrinking the core essence of Fire Emblem onto smaller hardware and not make it annoying to play. How did they accomplish this? Efficiency. Binding Blade reduced the amount of information that was displayed on screen, and instead did every battle calculation for you. And not just that either. You quickly realize how drawn out battle animations were in every game previously after playing the GBA Fire Emblems. All the fights played out in seconds. Every animation was fast, incredibly detailed, and never boring to watch repeatedly. Achieving a critical hit was something you more actively hoped would happen for the sheer bravado of the unique animations. Along with a brand new Smart End feature that ended turns automatically after every playable unit took their action, Binding Blade became a game that was much more fast-paced despite having the same amount of content as the previous titles. This made Fire Emblem a far more accessible game than it ever had been in the past. It opened up the doors to people who didn't want to or were unable to input a ton of mental effort, while still leaving that depth for the people who had already been playing these games. Perhaps not always in a good way though. While the game flow and UI made compromises to create a faster-paced game more suitable for handheld play, Fire Emblem's core design philosophies didn't change. Despite the game being on a smaller screen and character movement ranges reduced to compensate, maps are still just as large as they always had been. For a game where the MO was to create a Fire Emblem with wider appeal, there was still some questionable Kaga-era design that really doesn't make sense. Imagine how deserts slow units down. Imagine Wyvern Riders that can mitigate that range weakness. Imagine Fog of War missions and not being able to see far ahead. Imagine the single most frail unit in the series that must be protected. And imagine needing to consider all these things in under 25 turns if you want to see the true ending of the game. There is a map in Binding Blade that combines all of these elements! It would be one thing if only a few of the maps in the game were as terrible as this. But, it's not. Chapter 8 is one of the worst chapters I've ever played in a Fire Emblem game, and what feels strange about saying that is that there isn't anything that would obviously lead to that conclusion. It features a long, winding corridor until you eventually reach the boss, and that's it. There are turns where you won't even be fighting enemies. You'll spend a lot of your time just ferrying units. If it's not uninspired map design, it's strange map gimmicks that to an average person would be confusing. In order to unlock one of the side chapters, which again are required if you want to see the true ending of the game, you'll need to keep a certain enemy general alive by the time you seize the throne. A unit that is not recruitable and will be in pursuit of your party. Heck, I've played through this game multiple times, and I still haven't figured out an effective strategy that doesn't involve exploiting the enemy AI. And that's not to mention how still awful boss battles were. In Shadow Dragon and Mystery of the Emblem? Not too bad. Gaiden, Genealogy, and Thracia? Well, okay, we'll give them the benefit of the doubt. They're not all balanced games, so of course the bosses wouldn't be either. But Binding Blade doesn't have an excuse. For a game that scaled back on a ton of elements for the series, why not the bosses too? Not only are bosses higher level, sometimes promoted units you haven't been facing up to that point, the throne they sit on makes them stupid annoying to hit, even on top of their excessive defenses. I'm all for making bosses the most challenging enemies of a chapter. but far too many of the bosses in this game feel more dependent on RNG being in your favor than actually having a strategy against them. Even some of your best characters aren't likely to have more than a 50% hit chance against them. Combine this with the double number generator that this game implements, and you could potentially be facing enough turns passing by in attempts to kill one enemy that it's no longer a fun challenge anymore. Which leads me to the big takeaway from my time playing Binding Blade again. This game is actually pretty boring. I actually had to sit myself down and force myself to keep playing this game. And it's not the fact that this game is simple, that can work. But the problem is that this game tries to have its cake and eat it too. It implements so many new things that streamline the series and make it more bearable to play through, but still employs a lot of underlying concepts that truly made the older games so tedious. Now that I think about it, it's very appropriate that Roy is the lord of this game. His characteristics mirror Binding Blade almost too well, and I don't mean that as a compliment. It starts off with a good impression. There's nothing standing out as unique, but from an outside perspective, it looks like it'll be at least an average time. But it's not until the second act where its problems become concerning. And by the time it starts figuring itself out, the game's almost over, and doesn't give you enough time to properly appreciate how exciting its concepts are. I hope you don't plan to play this game simply because Roy is one of your favorite characters in Smash Bros. You'll probably be disappointed on both fronts. And despite my criticisms of Binding Blade, I do think that it has the fundamentals down. Ironically, it did a lot to bring the series forward by setting itself back. All Intelligent Systems had to do at this point was to examine the strengths and weaknesses of this new game they made, and bring them into consideration going forward. Considerations they began implementing immediately. With the development for Binding Blade concluded, the team started making another Fire Emblem immediately. And while that game was more scaled-back than any other in its series, it did so thinking of a much wider picture than the Fire Emblem series had ever seen before.